A very good morning on a chilly Johannesburg morning, but I'm here to warm you up with another exciting edition of your favorite program, Media Monitor. And we're ready to bring you sound analysis of some of the news that we're making headlines throughout this week. I'm your host, Alicia Ntlantla. Here's what we will be unpacking for you in the next hour. Stats South Africa says poverty in South Africa has now increased, but how does that impact us? Find out later. We also unpack why the Gupta family is now selling off some of their companies in the country. And will our national carrier receive a hefty 10 billion rand bailout from Treasury? And finally, we take a look at the media coverage on the disaster-stricken Sierra Leone. But first, as always, it is 9 a.m. Time to take a look at the news that are currently making headwaves. NC National Executive Committee member and chairperson of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, Derek Hanekom, has vowed to continue fighting against corruption and alleged state capture. Addressing the youth on state capture and corruption at the Apartheid Museum yesterday, Hanekom said letters threatening to discipline him would not deter him from speaking the truth. The NC wrote to Hanekom last week Monday, giving him just 10 days to provide reasons as to why he should not be removed as the party's chairperson of the disciplinary committee. But Hanekom says government has lost an estimated 100 billion rand through Gupta projects. He says he joined the NC to fight for the people's rights. Harmony Gold Mine Management says it is obliged to continue with rescue efforts at its Kusasaletu mine near Carltonville on the West Rand to ensure that the 4 remaining trapped miners are brought to the surface. The body of the 5th miner was recovered yesterday after being trapped underground following a rockfall due to a tremor. There were about 3,000 people underground when the incident happened on Friday morning, and trade union AMCU has vowed to take management to task over the safety of its members. And of course, Floyd, Mayweather has done it again after he defeated Conor McGregor in today's much-anticipated boxing match, claiming his 50th victory and maintaining his unbeaten record. Thousands of people across the world tuned in to catch the action. Undefeated welterweight boxing world champion Mayweather and mixed martial arts star McGregor were watched live before 20,000 fans at the T-Mobile Arena out in Las Vegas in Nevada. All right, our panelists today, we're very pleased to welcome on the digital front, SABC digital news producer, Mr. Tsepi Sobmosha. Tsepi, good morning.
Good morning to you, Alicia.
Good to have you with us. And on the main desk, I do have political analyst, Professor Kwandiwe Kondlo. What a pleasure, Prof. Good morning.
Thank you, Alicia.
All right, let's go to Cape Town in our studios there and welcome political analyst, Ms. Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, what a pleasure. Happy Women's Month. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, and happy Women's Month to you as well, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Sanusha. All right, so before everything gets going, what was the biggest hashtag this week?
The biggest hashtag for this week was the McGregor versus Mayweather. And this comes after the highly anticipated bout that was expected to take place this morning, took place around 6 a.m. And that we saw Floyd Mayweather defeating McGregor. And although there was much hype that Mayweather might lose this fight, that didn't happen. We saw Floyd Mayweather defeating McGregor in the 10th round. And these are some of the visuals, as you can see on your screen, Alicia.
Yeah, what are people saying? I'm very interested to hear the social media reaction there. It's a piece.
This one is from David saying, great fight, hashtag Mayweather, a true boxing strategist, still a legend, hashtag McGregor didn't throw a single punch for almost a minute in the final round.
Leonard Del Campo says that Mayweather derrota por no corto technico. I think he's talking about technique that is wild on the Mayweather side, I think. What is Aztec saying there?
This one says, if you know anything about boxing, you'd have known from the word-go that Mayweather was winning, no matter how much training McGregor did.
And Grace Roberts says, I'm so pissed, still love McGregor. All right.
Yes, and the final one says, after all that McGregor trying to turn Mayweather, he clearly underestimated his opponent. Hashtag McGregor versus Mayweather.
And last but not least, all right, we're not going to take that one. Professor, what did you make of this much anticipated fight? I mean, I know that they had to bring down the prices of the tickets later on in the week because people were just not budging. 20,000 rand per seat. How?
Yeah, it was interesting, and I actually also.
Did you watch the match, Prof?
No, I didn't watch the match.
You didn't watch the match, but are you happy with the outcome?
Yes, I am.
So, Nusha, let me just ask you, just for interest's sake, did you have any interest in the much anticipated fight between Mayweather and McGregor? And what did you make of the outcome this morning?
Hello?
All right, Sanusha can't hear us at this moment. Let's move on to the next big hashtag of this week while they sort out our sound issues in Cape Town. Let's check out the next big hashtag. Tsepiso, what was it?
Our next big hashtag was the coffin assault.
Ah, big story. Of course, the judge delivered a verdict on Friday.
Yes.
Tell us more about it.
And the judgment has been welcomed by many, saying this will send a strong message to potential racists who might want to entertain such racist acts, saying they hope that this will also be a message to, this will send a strong message to the KFC, so those white men who assaulted a couple at KFC in Montana, saying they are also hoping that a strong message will be sent in that case, Alicia.
All right. What are they saying on Twitter?
Well, as you can see, Alicia, on your screen, we have a tweet from Arts and Culture Minister Natim Teto saying, we welcome the guilty verdict handed down by Judge Sheila Mpahlele in the coffin assault case. It's a victory for our fight against racism.
Thank you, the Honourable Minister there. Minty Tatambo says the racists found guilty. Hope they get long sentences. Hashtag coffin assault. Next up will be the KFC assault. All these racists must go to jail. What's Yoba saying there, Tsepiso?
This one says, I hope the magistrate will not disappoint us with a light sentence. Hashtag coffin assault.
Well, I suppose we all are waiting the litigation of sentence now, Prof. What do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely waiting for the sentence. But this is a very good signal. And I hope people observe it.
All right. Let's try Sanusha one more time. Sanusha, can you hear us this time? And I want your commentary on the guilty verdicts. Well, we're trying to gauge the social media reaction on the coffin assault. Do tell us, what did you make of how people reacted to the 3 guilty verdicts of the 5 charges that were brought against the accused? All right, she still can't hear us. So should we do the final big hashtag of this week, and then we'll take it. We'll take an ad break, and then we'll try Sanusha when we get on with the main news.
Our final hashtag, Alicia, was ANN7 and the new age TNA. This comes after.
They've got a new owner.
Yes, this comes after Mzwane Lomanyi bought the new age and ANN7. And I must say, Alicia, that didn't go well on social media.
Did you have memes for us? Do you have memes?
No.
What do you have for us on social
we have
media?
tweets from this one actually is our former COO. Someone is suggesting that this is the new COO of ANN7.
There's a chick in there trying to, I think, swim. IG at Advocate Barry says the Guptas phones are off. Mkritama has been spotted running the Saxon world to find out the sell of ANN7 a new age. Tumzwanele Jimmy Mine. What's Small Rabbit saying there? And
this one says, so it means the Guptas can't choose to sell their assets to black South Africans. Otherwise, that will be perceived as affronting. Hashtag Guptas ANN7.
There is a meme. You did bring us a meme this morning. Let's roll up and see what other pictures came through for this, of course, for this segment. No more. All right. What can you tell us about this picture?
This is someone reacting to the news. Walking. I guess he's celebrating the news that ANN7 now will be under Jimmy Mani. As you can see here, hashtag obey Jimmy Mani after they told him that he was going to front.
He's doing the Vo show, I see. Professor.
That's interesting.
What did you think about this social media reaction?
Well, I haven't seen that one. I'm seeing it for the first time, and it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Shows excitement, I guess.
All right, let's try Cape Town one more time. Sanusha, your reactions to the social media side of Mzwanele Manyi, of course, buying ANN7 and, of course, the new age.
Yeah, I think, people may be surprised, but I think, he's come out in terms of where he positioned himself, what he probably really wants. And I think the social media spaces that you've put up on the screen. Definitely try and capture that. But coming back as well to the fact that we had an interesting fight this morning, I have to say I'm not one that watches boxing. I'm more of a football fan, so I'm more interested and happy that Manchester United won as well.
Thank you, Sanyosha Tsapiso. That's the end of our segment today. Do tell our viewers where they can get all these stories and more that are developing on our digital front. Go ahead.
Alicia, viewers at home can search for this show and other shows on our YouTube channel by simply searching for SABC Digital News. Alternatively, they can visit www.sabc.co.za/news for the latest news.
All right. Well, after the break, we take a look at what impacted on the dire increase of poverty in South Africa and how it will affect the ordinary citizen. That's all coming up after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Stats South Africa has released a poverty trends in South Africa report which shows that poverty levels rose in South Africa in 2015. Here are some of the major key findings. More than half of South Africans were poor in 2015, with the poverty head count increasing to 55.5% from a low of 53.2% back in 2011. Now, the figures are calculated using the upper bound poverty line of 992 Rand per person per month in 2015 prices. And then this, of course, translates into over 30.4 million South Africans living in poverty in the year 2015. Now, while these stats are alarming, they are still better than the country's poverty situation a decade earlier. In 2006, it was estimated that 2/3 of the country's population, that's 66.6 or roughly 31.6 million people, were living below the upper bound poverty line. And adjusted for inflation, the upper boundary poverty line in South Africa has now moved from 575 Rand per person per month in 2006 to 1,138 cents per person per month in 2017. Now, the bare minimum needed to survive has increased from 219 Rand in 2006 to 531 in 2017. Phew, let's find out more on this insert.
People are living in poverty given the population growth. Poverty levels are slightly better compared to 10 years ago, when 2 out of every 3 people lived in poverty. Interventions like social grants have brought some relief. But unemployment remains a key driver. Statistics show the likelihood of the unemployed staying out of jobs for longer periods has increased. Education levels are also closely related to poverty levels. Almost 80% of those without formal education are poor, compared to just over 8% of those who have tertiary qualifications. 3 out of every 5 black people are poor.
This points to a very serious problem for children, that they, in terms of poverty stakes, they bear the burden of poverty. In terms of unemployment, the youth bear the burden of unemployment. So they graduate from being children to being youth. They graduate from poverty as children into being unemployed as youth. So it's a very serious problem, and certainly grants do probably certainly have to go a long way in ensuring that children are in school and they get a meal and all kinds of things. But far from enough to get children out of poverty.
Impacted are in rural areas in Limpopo and the Eastern Cape. This gives rise to migration, creating poverty in the urban centers. Lehotla says government's planning and the statistics don't tally.
The people come from technicons who are 15 to 34 suffer as the same level for unemployment as those with matric. Those who are 35 and above actually show that they are much more employable when they have technical education. Now, is it because they are of different age, or is it something talking to the quality of education at Technicon for those who, the current quality of education in Technicons now? Then we've got to go back to our policies and say, what happened in that policy space in relation to technical education that condemns those who have been to it to unemployment in recent times? So unless we start looking at these numbers as policymakers, we are far from resolving the problems of South Africa.
The tough economic climate will likely push more South Africans into poverty going forward. Lehotla says the picture looks bleak. With the economy in recession, the sovereign downgraded to sub-investment grade, companies retrenching staff due to the subdued demand of products and the poor confidence levels. Gloria Safagomusi, SABC News, Johannesburg.
All right, before the stat G kills me there, Prof, I think South Africa's moved from 575 Rand per month per person in 2006 to 1,138 Rand per person per month in 2017. I mean, the stat G, they're saying we are far from solving South Africa's problems unless we adhere to some of these terms, Prof. Let's just get your general thinking on the stats.
Alicia, the picture it's not good. Yeah, and it's actually quite sad and a bit depressing to look at these figures. And unfortunately, this contrasts with what you get when you look at the wealthy top 10%. Because their level of accumulation and the wealth they create is actually increasing. Whereas the poorest of the poor are getting even poorer. So this is quite concerning. I hear the point about policymakers looking into the statistics and deciding what to do. But besides just policy making, the issue in South Africa is about leadership aptitude. You see? Because you could have all these good policies, but when you have unethical leaders who are so self-centered through their networks and connections, you see, the impact and the leadership at policy level is also affected. So in other words, when you look at these figures, they talk a lot. There's a lot they disclose about the political economy challenges of South Africa as a country.
Sanusha, what do you think? I mean, what do you think really exacerbated these figures?
I think it's a combination of factors, Alicia. I think when you look at the structural conditions, both domestically and internationally, questions around whether or not we had sufficiently attracted investment, because the policies that we have in terms of driving economic growth in the country are investment-centric. And so, in a sense, whether the structural conditions in the country permitted for that kind of investment to come in. Also bearing in mind that we had come at the back of a financial crisis. So we may not have been hit directly by the international financial crisis of 2008, but it did have staggering indirect, if not structural, impacts for our economy. And then, of course, domestic policy and leadership and governance questions also become critical to the whole equation of whether or not we are addressing the poverty trap or the poverty dynamic in the country. And I think those are exacerbating conditions in terms of how much of pressure is placed on the economy, notwithstanding the fact that we are having a lot, we do have people that are graduating from both university and secondary school, grade 12s, who are unable to get jobs in terms of going into the job market or even being able to go into formal training programs and so forth. And I think at the end of last year, Stats SA had come up with the fact that in the last 13 years, we've seen the highest level of unemployment in the country. I think what we should be bracing ourselves with now is what's going to be the combination and the exacerbation of what we've seen as downgrades with our credit rating. That's going to make it much more difficult. And so if this is the current environment and the staggering figures we're seeing around the poverty dynamics and the poverty trap that Stats SA has released in its report, that was for 2015. I shudder to think what will happen from between now and in terms of 2019, how much more the poverty dynamic will become acute and chronic in the country, particularly because we're going to see the increasing of inflation even more, even though Stats or the Reserve Bank has said that it's within the bandwidth of what they consider as 3 to 6%. But it does not mean that people actually have disposable income in their pockets, etc.
But Sanusha, you know, when you're speaking about addressing the poverty dynamic, we know, Professor, for example, that those living in the Eastern Cape and Limpopo are the biggest victims when it comes to poverty. And also, in the report, the statue mentioned the fact that women are more likely to be living below the poverty line, more so the women in the rural areas. Back to the issues of service delivery here, Prof. What then needs to happen to try and address this poverty dynamic?
Look, I think really in our policy and implementation strategies, we need to set firm priorities.
Do we have current structures that are aimed at addressing and alleviating poverty, particularly in those rural areas that we've mentioned?
Look, we do have structures, because when you listen to government reporting, they'll tell you of war rooms for this and a war room for that, you see. So, but we need to be strong at the level of implementation, because if you look at poverty levels, the same historical trends that have obtained in the past, where you find that former Bantustan's, and especially women in rural areas, were at the extreme margin of the economy. That is still continuing even today. So which actually means that we really need firm implementation which is targeted on a few strategic areas, so that we can change this trend.
You know, Sanusha, I want you to speak to this and the fact that women are still the victims of living below the poverty line. I mean, the report says only 8.4% with post-matric qualifications are actually considered poor. What do you interpret this then as meaning?
It does mean that women are still at the bottom end of the economic ladder.
Yeah.
Access, opportunity, being able to actually get into the financial sector has been basically marred by severe obstacles. And most importantly, I think the report in itself raises two fundamental issues in a sense. We're talking about rural poverty here.
Yeah.
And we're talking about not just rural poverty, we're talking about rural poverty in particular provinces. But I think this is the beltway of South Africa's agricultural sector as well. And if we are not taking into account how much of investment is going to go into that sector, which is essentially linked back to the very stakeholders, which is constituencies like women, etc., then we are facing a serious challenge. Coupled with that is also the question of how do we deal with natural disaster. We know about the governance questions, we know about the policy questions, we know about the investments, but the natural disaster questions, the drought, etc., the El Nino effects are going to be important as well in terms of how we prepare ourselves from a policy perspective in going forward. And lastly, I think that into this mix of not just women, I think the other thing that was very significant about the report was the issue of children who are living in poverty households and are actually further away from the poverty line. That in itself is going to become even more acute as we go forward. So I think, yes, we may have policies, yes, we may have certain things on paper, but the question is, are we really putting into practice those policies? Are we investing in those policies so that there is tangible agricultural infrastructure development in order to provide the kinds of employment so that women can actually get into that space?
Very interesting points you bring out, Sanusha. I mean, we are currently in a technical recession, Prof, and we know that the economic growth has now been projected further down to just 0.5%. That is absolutely worrying. And then these are only 2015 stats. So by the time the next stats, I mean, it looks like the picture might be even bleaker. Yeah, it looks like the picture is actually not going to look good. Yeah. Yes, in the years after 2015, you see. But what I find interesting really is the question I'm asking myself is, how much foreign direct investment are we getting, and especially around 2015? Yeah. And what is the impact of this foreign direct investment on the South African economy? Yeah. And secondly, I like the point Sanusha is emphasizing, the role of agriculture and rural development in this, yes. We really don't find tangible impact or results
of the rural development and agricultural strategies that have been devised by
And there's so
the
much fight about land. What are you going to do with that land if you're not going to make it profitable and feed you? All right, let's take a quick ad break. That's all we had time for on the topic. After the break, are the Guptas getting ready to leave? We tackle that after the short break. It's coming up after this. Watching Media Monitor here on the SABC News channel. British-based PR company Pottinger was found guilty this past week by the UK Public Relations Industry Body, Public Relations and Communications Association, or PRCA, for violating its code over work it did for the Gupta family. The Democratic Alliance has since called for Pottinger to disclose all its contracts with the Gupta family. The party mentioned that during the company's work for the Gupta-owned Oak Bay Capital, Pottinger exploited sensitive race relations in South Africa. Now, the DA's complaint was based on information revealed in the highly publicized Gupta email leaks. Meanwhile, PRCA is due to publish its decision about whether Pottinger should be sanctioned for its Gupta work in the week that is commencing September 4. I just want to hear your quick reviews. Prof, what did you make of this ruling?
It's a very interesting ruling, which actually shows that in other countries, the issue of ethics is taken seriously.
Very important.
And you actually wonder if this happened in South Africa and if we were the PRCA in South Africa, would we go to that extent, really? But of course, it's going to be very interesting to see the kind of decisions they're going to come up with on this matter.
So, Nusha, do you think this then, the findings authenticates all the Gupta leaks?
I think it does to a certain extent, but I think, you know, the actual issues that emerge out of the Gupta leak emails, the questions that have emerged around interference in contracts and undue kind of breach of confidence and using their ability to influence doesn't absolve it in a big way. This is one company that now has been sanctioned by the Code of Conduct in the UK. You have to ask yourself again, why did this company go to such lengths knowing that that its own PR was at risk? And so this is the other question I think comes up with this. But at the end of the day, whether or not they get sanctioned, depending on what kind of code of conduct and action is taken against this company, I think the bigger questions for us is how do we deal with all of this fallout in South Africa, and what are we going to be doing in the context of what we are now seeing being unearthed through these Gupta email leaks. But most importantly is who's going to take responsibility and where the action is going to come from to even recoup some of those losses that has been made in the context of our economy.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, I just want to know from you, Professor, I mean, the DA has been at the forefront of all of this, but all the other political parties have been silent on the issue. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, sometimes with the way how opposition parties work as a front, it's very difficult to see consistency. And I guess it's also linked to the kind of resources and connections they have. And it's very interesting really to see how the DA has pushed and gone out of its way to really follow up on this particular issue. And other opposition parties are actually taking a backseat. Yeah.
So, Nusha, let's talk about how now the Gupta family has since started disposing of some of their assets, most notably their media houses, NN7 and their newspaper, The New Age, to former government spokesperson, Mr. Jimmy Manyi. I mean, what are your thoughts on the legitimacy of this? A lot of people are saying, this is so not true. We're just, you know, somebody's pulling a wool over our eyes.
I mean, it depends, you know, until we see the actual transaction and the paperwork that shows that ownership has been transferred to the new owners, etc. I think that's what we have to look at. These things will happen in the context of the JSE shifting of resources, of shares, etc. But I think that's not the real issue right here, whether or not the Guptas now decide, okay, we're going to leave the country, but we're going to leave it and we're going to basically sell off assets. The question is, up until now, the Guptas have enjoyed an undue benefit as a result of their so-called relationships that they've crafted in the political space of the country. So leaving the country and saying we're handing over to the next, to black economic empowerment groups, etc., doesn't necessarily mean that they have been able to, that the investigation has been able to unearth at what level are they leaving the country and what money are they taking out of the country?
Yeah.
Because that, again, will also play a critical role in terms of how much of capital flight we'll see from South Africa and South African money that leaves and goes into another destination, wherever the Guptas are going to resettle themselves in terms of opening up or continuing their commercial transactions outside of South Africa. And I think that that money that leaves the country, there needs to be some checks and balances, and we do know that in terms of the broader debates about illicit transaction flows out of the continent, there's been that whole question about bringing money back that can help to actually stimulate and be a catalyst for Africa's development in terms of mobilization of domestic resources. And for me personally, I think it's not enough to just say, yes, we're leaving. The question is, at what cost are you leaving and what are you leaving the country in?
Well, Sanusha, they're claiming that it's become so difficult to do business in South Africa because half of their banking accounts have been closed. But, Prof, don't you find it suspicious that they're now just liquidating their assets and about to ready to leave the country, it seems?
Yeah, there's a lot which is really fluid about all this. And a lot of gray areas. I
mean, the Pottinger ruling and then the dissolving of the shares, I mean, that's something to look at.
Yes, yes, and at the same time, really, we don't know how much they are leaving behind South Africa and how much they are taking out of South Africa. Yeah, so, like I say, it's just so fluid and so gray. It's difficult to put an exact finger on what is actually happening.
So, Sanusha, what do you think really should happen? Should the Guptas be kept in South Africa to try at least first account for some of the allegations that have been brought against them? I mean, we know that there's a commission of inquiry to look into state capture that is about to be indicted. And of course, aren't the people that are fingered in that scandal supposed to be there to account?
Indeed, Alicia, I think there has to be some kind of oversight mechanism where I think there's the banking ombudsman that also needs to play a role here, but there's oversight mechanism or panel or whatever we want to call it, some kind of facility that says we need to look at what happened in the period in which these transactions have been taking place. Because it's one thing to just say we're going to sell off assets, liquidate assets, and then move out. The question is, once you start doing that, you're moving money into offshore spaces as well. And then that makes it even more difficult to try and track that money back. Or even try and get that money back into the country. So in a sense, we've got to look at a cost-benefit analysis and ask ourselves, at what cost is South Africa losing a lot of money with this liquidation of assets and so forth, and how much of this could have actually been used for real development, the kinds of development we talked about and we identified when we spoke about the Stats SA poverty report. So I think something needs to be done. Nobody can just say, okay, I'm tired now, I don't like what's going on here, I'm going somewhere else. It doesn't work like that.
Absolutely doesn't. So then who should do this cost analysis and make sure that the Guptas stay to account, Prof?
I guess our government regulators should actually do that, yes. And it's so unfortunate because this whole story about the Guptas...
In what form, though? In a form of charges, legal, criminal charges? In what form, Prof?
Look, there's a commission they keep talking about, the Judicial Commission, to actually look into this entire Gupta story and look into everything. It's unfortunate that we don't have clear time frames and it's being delayed, you see, because this issue has been going on and it's really destructive because there are a lot of policy and agenda issues we should be debating as South Africans.
True.
But we're being sidetracked by this Gupta and issues and so forth, you see. So the sooner this commission starts, you see, but it's now being used for political bargaining in the run-up to the elections,
That's
ANC
true.
elections, you see. Rather than have this commission look at this Gupta issue comprehensively so that we can start focusing on issues of policy, service delivery, and how do we move South African social formation forward.
Absolutely. That's what the Deputy President was saying. He says everybody must just wait for this commission to be instituted so that they can actually get the answers that they so seek. Government promises to keep SA flying, but at what cost? Find out after this short break. You're watching Media Monitor. Back. Struggling national carrier South African Airways could be up for another financial bailout. Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba reiterated government's desire to hold on to the entity. However, Gigaba would not reveal details of how exactly SAA would be recapitalized, saying a decision should be approved by Cabinet by the end of next month. Democratic Alliance Member of Parliament, Mr. Alf Leers, announced on Wednesday during a question and answer session with the Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa in Parliament that government was mulling the sale of its nearly 40% shareholding in Telkom that is valued at more than 14 billion rand and would then allocate that money to South African Airways. Sanusha, what do you make of those allegations by Mr. Leers?
I mean, this is a situation where you can't keep throwing money into an empty hole. And I think the point about it is that SAA has always been brought to or been given the option of a bailout. It's always been bailed out. It had its roots in terms of the travel routes it's been used. There's been an option to code share with other airlines. They've reduced the kinds of facilities that you find on domestic flights. In all of this as cost-cutting measures to try and bring SAA back into a more financial stable environment. Throwing money into the system doesn't work. We've seen this. It needs, I don't know what it needs, but it does need something to show that it needs a management kind of a restructuring. It needs to actually have perhaps a better way in which its governance and its financial governance architecture is defined. We've seen also that SAA has been part of this whole extension of what has been happening in other so-called SOEs with regard to linkages to board members that have been incompetent or inefficient, allegations of misappropriation of funds and so forth. So at the end of the day, is it the right way to do it? Throw money into a system which hasn't really performed. By actually selling off your stocks at the value that you're going to do with Telkom and then put it into SAA, what's the benefit? What's going to be the turnaround for this airline? And right now, perhaps there should be other options that should be considered on the table in terms of looking at maybe not privatization completely, but actually looking at how perhaps you need to think about engaging with some kind of semi-privatization or a public-private partnership engagement with regard to SAA. The efficiency, I think, is important, but most importantly is that the more money you put into this airline, it's becoming more costly to run this airline, and the kind of fleets that they have right now and the fleets that they intend to buy is going to actually shoot up the price, and it's going to become the price that people on the ground, passengers have to pay. Right now, passengers may not be paying. For example, flying to the Middle East, for example, or flying to UAE. Most of the time, you're flying on Emirates Airline anyway, but you're paying with a SAA flight ticket. So I'm not sure what the real equation is, or what the real thing is, because from the time I can remember, there's always been a bailout for SAA, but it hasn't shown that it has become sustainable. But
I mean, let's look at the reasons that the board actually provided to Parliament as to why they were making a shortfall. I mean, stuff about routes, Professor, that were not profitable, and the leasing of about 30 aircraft. They actually don't own a massive number of aircraft. And then what is needed then for them to try and get a budget that is going to sustain everything and keep the airline flying?
You see, Alicia, I still think the bailout they're going to get is not going to help SAA.
Well, it's not going to be enough.
It's not going to help SAA. And secondly, I still don't understand the policy framework from which the bailout is actually crafted. What is the policy informing the bailout? How many times?
Well, that's to pay off the debts and the loans that they currently cannot pay.
Is going to bail out SAA. How many times? because this has happened several times in the past. Yeah? And if you look at governance issues at the SAA, they are so overwhelming. Yeah? From the appointment of board members through political connections.
Flawed processes, yeah.
People have no reputation or record of turning around any company. But because they are connected, then they are thrown into the board.
So it's an organizational issue,
It's an organization in perpetual crisis. Until our leaders really wake up to this. We are wasting taxpayers' money, throwing them into SAA, without attending to serious issues of governance at SAA. But at the same time, looking at all state-owned enterprises in South Africa.
Yeah.
Do we need a specific legislation to help us deal with issues in state-owned enterprises? Do we need a specific set of policies to deal with SOEs? These are the questions we really need to debate and look into the regulatory framework that we already have, because it seems it's not really helping us.
Yeah. So, Nisha, you know, Deputy President also proposed that they're looking at a proposal where the SOEs might be collapsed and paired up into 9 sectors where they actually see which ones will perform in a group type of setting, for lack of a better word. Do you think that strategy might then curb the wasteful expenditure that is incurred by these SOEs?
Well, streamlining these SOEs into perhaps a specific set of sectors may make certain sense. But again, I think before you get to that point, you have to deal with all of the political undertones to the SOEs themselves. People who may feel that they don't want to actually engage in some kind of streamlining exercise. But at the same time, I think that you're going to have those that are going to feel that this sector doesn't necessarily make sense to be in another sector. So again, the question is, where does the actual recipe to try and get a more efficient SOE sector come in? We've seen South Africa do a number of study tours. The government has embarked on study tours looking at how rationalization, looking at transformation of the SOE sector has taken place in Europe, and I think they've also looked at China, if I'm not mistaken. But again, it's a question of you need to streamline your business. What is your business operation? And so if your business operation is very key to what your actual transactional operations are, then you can streamline it. But at the end of the day, I think in cases like aviation, telecommunications, etc., I would prefer to see more competition in the market. Because I think that also creates efficiency. It also doesn't allow for people to become almost complacent to say, I'll sit on this board and I'll continue to remain on the board. One of the airlines I find very interesting, which has shown to become very, very successful over a short period of time, is Ethiopian Airlines. They're flying all over the continent. They have about several routes to the east, and they're flying to China. They have brought on Chinese-speaking cabin crew. They're kind of finding the right mix here. And they're not doing it in a manner that's very, very, what you call as opulent. You know, they're doing it in a manner that they can actually manage. And so there's a question between the opulence and what you want to do versus the kind of efficiency. And it's become a very popular airline, especially as a destination between Delhi, China, Addis Ababa, and South Africa.
All right. Well, nicely said there from Sanusha. Let's take a quick ad break. After that, the death toll mounts in Sierra Leone disaster. It's all coming up here on Media Monitor when we return. It's our final segment. Let's look at Continental news. Now, the South African government has announced plans to contribute 8 million rand to Sierra Leone as part of relief efforts following a deadly mudslide that took the lives of more than 500 people. Well, scores are still missing and thousands of people have been displaced by the disaster. And authorities this week buried more than 400 bodies in quickly dug graves amid fears of the risk of the diseases. Prof, what do you think about this development in Sierra Leone and, of course, the pledge to help from South Africa? Do you think it's going to assist?
Yes, definitely. I think the response from South Africa is a very positive one. And I actually hope even the private sector can actually respond. Join hands and do something. The situation in Sierra Leone is a sad one. because this is a country which, like many other African states, has been experiencing governance challenges. This is one country where, in my readings, I first saw what they call urban-based service delivery protests. Yes, and so it's a country which really needs help at this stage, and it's a country which faces many of the challenges other African states are currently challenging.
So, Nusha, your views on this issue, and of course the pledge to help by South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, Elisha, this is a country that has been through so much over the years. I mean, as Prof rightly pointed out, it's been through political crises, it's gone through a series of internal conflicts, intra-conflict tensions, wars, people being displaced, and now it's undergoing a natural disaster. So it's really a country that, in many ways, is trying to move beyond its immediate crises in terms of domestic, political, economic, ethnic tensions, but now it's to deal with a natural disaster. But I think that also tells us how important it is that as these countries move out of a post-conflict environment, that the infrastructure then needs to be developed. But because of the impact of political fighting and conflict and so forth, the infrastructure becomes very weakened. And so getting it to a point where you can invest and build the infrastructure takes some time. And then as a result, they become susceptible, vulnerable, and end up in a situation where the floods have caused such undue damage. And I think South Africa's role in terms of supporting the country humanitarianly with the funds is all part of the way in which the African Renaissance Fund has always been seen in the context of South Africa and its role with African development and so forth.
So, Sanusha, do you think Africa does have adequate resources to deal with its own disasters, be it like your mudslides and the other atrocities throughout the continent? Do you think we have the relevant structures to act adequately and fast enough?
Well, the idea from a technical perspective, or rather from a policy perspective, is that on paper, yes, they are moving towards that early warning systems that the AU had created as part of its agenda around dealing with natural disasters. I know that certain countries have engaged with India and China to set up satellites that will help them to determine weather patterns before the disasters actually strike, etc. These all take time to come on board. And right now, I think with countries that are vulnerable to these kinds of natural disasters, I don't think they're at that point where they can succinctly say, oh yes, we've got all mechanisms in place and we can do it. I think once the early warning systems kick in, they'll be able to have perhaps a relative way in which to deal with it and to respond to it. But in terms of the West African regional bloc, ECOWAS, I think they do have some capacity, but I think the capacity is more geared towards dealing with interventions around peace and security and so forth. Dealing with this kind of early warning systems, I think, still needs to be built up. The AU, I think, looks at a capacity force, but again, it's around the peace and security mediation efforts. I think when it comes to natural disasters, we still have to basically improve and consolidate that at a much deeper level for the African continent.
Absolutely. So you're saying that, the issues of climate change and, the ever-changing severe weather patterns really are things that need to be at the top of agendas when these discussions actually take place, Prof?
Yes, the African Union does have, in fact, we are very good in Africa in producing all these policy papers and long documents. But the major challenge is getting things done.
Yes, everywhere, it seems. All right. Well, Sanusha Naidu, thank you so much for joining us. She was joining us from our Cape Town studio. And here with me in Johannesburg, Professor Conor, giving us sound analysis of some of the biggest newsmakers of this week. We do return next week, same time and place, for another fresh round of news that we're making headlines with a fresh round of guests as well. I'm Anisha Jali, and I'm back on top of the hour with M News. Don't go anywhere.